So, in this segment, we're going to be talking about the government actually admitting to making mistakes before and during the two lockdowns that was it two or three we went through? God, my brain can't remember now. It's been so long since I was allowed outside with other people. It feels like. Anyways, the government have finally admitted to making mistakes during the first and second lockdown. This isn't to dunk on the government, although I do enjoy doing that, or to say, hey, Captain Hindsight here telling you what you should have done, but to say that what the government kind of knew and why, they were a bit slow in dealing with things, or shall I say, very slow in dealing with things. And we're going to be talking about some of the stuff where the government didn't actually listen to the science, and we have more and more evidence of that, as more and more information comes out. So let's actually get into the video. So Boris Johnson accepts it was a mistake to delay the start of the first national lockdown. Close allies have said, while insisting the Prime Minister was let down by scientific advisors. So they're going to throw the SAGE committee, so people like Valence and the rest of them, and also civil servants under the bus here for a lot of the failures of the government. Mr. Johnson would act harder, earlier, and faster if he had time. Again, isn't that a Kanye West song? Harder, faster, strong. No, slightly different. If he had his time again, supporters say raising the possibility of a mea culpa moment in a future inquiry into the handling of the pandemic. So I think he's going to say, I did my best, and if I could do it again, I would do it differently. And that way, he's going to hopefully avoid the blame of the public from his perspective, anyways. Yeah. As the first anniversary of lockdown approaches, Mr. Johnson has rightfully won plaudits for the runaway success of the vaccine rollout, which he does deserve credit for, but knows he will eventually have to confront the question of why the UK had suffered the highest death toll per capita in Europe and the fifth largest in the world. And, if a public inquiry doesn't happen and we don't know full details, then, clearly something is being hidden from the public. And that is something I will want to see and will push for a public inquiry for as limited as my powers are. The Telegraph has learnt that the pivotal moment in imposing lockdown came on the 14th of March, 9 days before the lockdown started, when Mr. Johnson was shown evidence that ministers and scientific advisors had badly miscalculated how quickly the NHS would be overwhelmed. So, obviously science is always a moving thing, and so some of the scientists do deserve some blame for the mistakes made, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with the government, and other countries use the pandemic playbook from, Asia. Countries like Vietnam, Japan, etc., did really well dealing with the pandemic early on, and those countries were followed by Australia and New Zealand. They followed the example of those Asian countries, and they all did very well. Ministers and officials involved in the COVID response have said it should not be viewed through the prism of 2020 hindsight, but admitted the Prime Minister's instinct for delaying decisions as long as possible was the worst approach in the midst of a pandemic. A guy who models himself after Winston Churchill, who made decisions at key moments, some of them right, some of them wrong, but at least he was brave enough to make decisions, as flawed a character as Churchill was. Johnson is a guy where he struggles to make decisions, and he waits for the last minute, and people have died because of it. In a week-long series of articles investigating the early response to the pandemic beginning on Sunday, senior figures in government also admit to making mistakes over test and trace. Finally, test and trace, absolute shambles. And I want to see why they gave that contract to all of those private companies who had no background in doing testing or tracing or anything to do with that. PPE, care homes, that's an interesting one we'll be talking about towards the end of the video, and pandemic planning ahead of a promised independent inquiry once the pandemic is over. Fat chance that's going to happen. Also, the fact that, under Theresa May's government, they analysed that the biggest danger to the country was a pandemic. Ministers and civil servants are likely to point the finger at each other. Realistically, it's down to the ministers that are at fault here. They're the elected officials. They're elected to make decisions. The civil servants just follow them. Senior government figures claim the civil service was overconfident it could handle the crisis, while blame will be directed at ministers for being too preoccupied with their political goals in the wake of their general election victory weeks earlier, not to mention the fact that, Boris Johnson missed multiple COBRA meetings at the start of last year. Also the fact that Whitty and Valance allowed the Cheltenham Festival to, go ahead last year. That was, a bad call. Questions need to be asked of how much they knew and when. So if we actually scroll down and look at the timeline, I couldn't highlight these bits. So I might be just a bit sort of all over the place here. But amid growing questions about whether the UK should follow Italy's example, this is on the 8th of March of 2020, by imposing a lockdown, a senior government source briefed the media saying that the Italian approach is based on populist, non-science-based measures that aren't any use. Okay then. 12th of March, the UK Chief Medical Officers raised the threat level from moderate to high. Public Health England stops carrying out contact tracing, arguing that capacity has been overwhelmed. Sir Patrick Vallance says the country needs to build up herd immunity, but obviously that was not the strategy that the government went for, thankfully, in the end. March 11th, at an emergency meeting in Downing Street, Ben Warner, a data analyst, presents evidence that the NHS will be overwhelmed within a week after discovering the squash the sombrero policy is failing to keep the virus in check. The number of confirmed cases rises to 1,061, a five-fold increase in the space of a week. That's how fast this thing was spreading. And so, March 14th, they were told that, the NHS will be overwhelmed within a week. And it took him to March 23rd to actually make the decision to lock down the country, which is just embarrassingly long. Others said Mr. Johnson had learnt from previous mistakes. But the thing is, those mistakes that they made during the first lockdown also happened during the second wave of the virus. And, people like Dishi Rishi accelerated the pace of the second wave by doing schemes like Eat Out to Help Out. So it's just embarrassing. And, the idea that Boris Johnson learnt from these mistakes is a lie, purely because he didn't. We know he didn't, because we had to go into a second lockdown, because at that point we were having, mass amounts of people within hospitals, people being moved from hospital to hospital because they run out of space. So the idea that Boris Johnson had learnt his lesson from the first wave is an absolute myth. And we look here, this is about the first lockdown. The UK's chief scientific advisor had said the government was urged to impose a full lockdown measure around a week before they were introduced. On that day, they were told that the NHS would be overwhelmed. Is somewhere here. March 14th, the government were told that the NHS would be overwhelmed within a week, and it took him a whole week to actually make a decision. Vallance made the revelation about the timings of the guidance from the scientific sage, as he suggested many factors would determine how well countries have responded to the COVID-19 outbreak. We also know that Dominic Cummings also played a part in the lockdown decision. So Boris Johnson's most powerful political aide pressed the UK's independent advisors to recommend lockdown measures in an effort to stop the spread of coronavirus, according to people familiar with the matter. The government has confirmed that Cummings was an observer at some of the meetings, the secretive body which gave advice to the government. But according to two people, Cummings played a far more important role than just a bystander, as the panel discussed social distancing options. Speaking on condition of anonymity because of the meetings are private, the people said Cummings asked why a lockdown was not being imposed sooner, swayed the discussion towards faster action, and made clear he thought pubs and restaurants should be closed within days. They then were. So Cummings, looking like he actually had a decent impact on the SAGE committees. But the thing is, who is he pushing back against? Because the scientists modelled for, the scientists did push these things. Two people who took part in the meeting said Cummings' actions went further than simply asking for information. They're suggesting Cummings' influence group's lockdown decisions is likely to cast doubt on the government's assurances that it simply followed the scientific advice. So Cummings had a decent impact, but the thing is, he should never have had an impact. And the further question is, who was he trying to convince here? Because we know that the government tried to claim that they're balancing the science with the economics, but the simple fact is, by trying to side with the economic advisors or siding with the economic impact became far worse because of the simple fact that the lockdowns had to be longer because we didn't lock down soon enough. So it's very strange that Johnson's, Dominic Cummings had a positive impact. But if we actually listen to the information from one of the SAGE scientists, John Edmonds, who originally had kind of pushed herd immunity and then tried to rewrite it a bit, he talks about a lack of, the the thought that people within the UK would not comply with the lockdown rules. So this is, a bit longer, this clip, but it's very interesting. I'm not going to play all of it, don't worry.
I think that at the time it was difficult to imagine, we weren't sure by what levels of compliance with various social distance measures were possible.
And the thing is, who was telling them that what and which things were not possible? That's the question that I would want to know. Like, these scientists would push out these ideas like social distancing, lockdowns, etc. Who told them that these things were not possible? That's the question. That's something I want to know.
It hadn't been done in the UK or even in Europe up until Italy then started going into lockdown around the middle of March. And I think that changed things. I think that changed the way that up until that point, you'd seen very restrictive measures taken place in China. And I think it was hard to imagine that we would do that here in the UK.
Was that why you didn't model full lockdown until the middle of March?
I think it was very hard. I don't think anybody looked at it. It wasn't just myself. I don't think anybody. We all looked at a range of different measures, some of which were very stringent. But it was, it's difficult to say, but it was difficult to imagine just how, well, in some sense, it was difficult to imagine just how easy the lockdown was, if you see what I mean. That people actually would go along with it.
So if you'd known how compliant the British population would be... No, but if you hadn't known, I'm just saying if you...
So this is why it's interesting to see that. Why did he think that the public would not comply with these decisions? That's something that, I want him to answer. I want one of them to answer why they didn't think the public would comply with these decisions.
Had known, looking back now...
We possibly know that. We'd never done this before.
But if you had known... You would have recommended lockdown earlier.
We couldn't possibly have known that.
No, I'm not suggesting you could have known it, but now you do know it. Do you think it would have been advisable to have imposed lockdown earlier? It would have saved lives.
As I said, I think you've got to make a balance. And thankfully, I don't have to make that balance, but people have to, politicians have to make those decisions and make that balance between what might be. If you look just narrowly at COVID, then the best thing is to keep people in lockdown and not to release people from lockdown until there's a vaccine. But that's taking a very narrow view and far too narrow a view. You can't do that, and so you have to balance them off that off with other things, with other strategies, and with other things. I mean, other health implications of...
I like how he said other things twice. I think I might have let that run a bit too long. However, it's important to note that this is about the second lockdown. So we'll talk about that now. I've mixed it up a bit. Here we go. This is the one I wanted. So this is about the second lockdown now, where the government, again admits mistakes, which is surprising considering this government doesn't like doing that. They talk about faith, belief. Surprise, at some point they're going to talk about Heart the Cards or something. But, cabinet ministers and senior officials have told the BBC the government should have brought in tougher restrictions in early autumn to tackle the inevitable second wave of coronavirus. In the run-up to the anniversary of the lockdown, which I'm not sure if that's gone already, BBC News has spoken off the record to more than 20 senior politicians, officials and former officials about the key moments of the last 12 months. The investigation revealed frustration in government about Boris Johnson's unwillingness to tighten restrictions in September. So you can see this is firmly on Boris Johnson here, because he was the one in charge of making these decisions. One senior minister said the government should have locked down more severely in autumn, while another said it had been totally ridiculous to be arguing about whether people should return to office when there was inevitably going to be a second wave. Another one said the biggest mistake was the rush of blood. In the summer, there was a sense of denial about the second wave. Another, we kept repeating the same mistakes over and over again, despite the masses of evidence that kept coming up. And so the idea that Boris Johnson has learnt his lesson is untrue. He loves dithering and delaying. Matt Hancock said he had listened to all the evidence, but the thing is, you can listen to all the evidence if people are talking about my health, for example. I'm not healthy, and they said, some people saying live your life how you want to live your life, and other people saying you're obese, you're going to get type 2 diabetes most likely. And I said, well, I've listened to all the evidence and I've decided I'm going to carry on living my life how I want. And you're going to look at me like I'm an idiot. And the thing is, that's what the government are basically doing here. We've listened to, all the evidence, and we've decided to delay decisions and let people die. That's what I'm seeing here. Matt Hancock added, you have to balance all the different considerations. It's all at the Prime Minister's desk. So I think he's kind of subtly throwing Boris Johnson under the bus here. That makes all these different considerations come together, the health impact and the economic impact. But the thing is, if they prioritise the health of the British public, what that would mean is that the economic situation wouldn't be as bad. But the simple case is our economy's tanked, I think, the most out of all the G7 countries. Some of that's down to, other factors. But the simple fact is we're down, by the most, in part because of the longer lockdowns needed, because Boris Johnson failed to make good decisions in the first place. We can also reveal that Boris Johnson had been briefed by officials ahead of a press conference on March the 3rd, right at the start of the pandemic, to discourage people from shaking hands with each other. Instead, when he took the lectern, the Prime Minister boasted he shook hands with everybody at the hospital, and then I think not far off after that, he caught COVID. So it's pretty embarrassing, what's happened here. So yeah, we've got a couple more bits to go through, so it's not over yet. So this is about the second lockdown. The government's scientific advisors called for a short lockdown in England to halt the spread of COVID-19 last month. This article written in October about a lockdown that should have happened in September. The experts said an immediate circuit breaker was the best way to control cases at a meeting on the 21st of September, but Robert Jenrick said the government had taken robust action that balanced the impact on the economy. Again, because they tried to prioritise the economy, what happened was it tanked even worse. Certain things you can't rush, and, the government tried to run on a sprained ankle and just made it worse. That's what happened here. And their decisions led to many, many deaths which shouldn't have happened. And also the fact that the SAGE modelling was always going to be flawed, because they took into account things which the government didn't actually do. So they thought that the government was actually going to protect care homes, but they didn't. So if we look here, this is from John Edmonds again. So ministers failed to act on early advice to protect care home residents from coronavirus, a member of the government's SAGE committee has revealed. Epidemiologist John Edmonds also admitted SAGE should have been bolder in the guidance it gave to ministers when advising the government on how to combat the spread of COVID-19. So my theory is that, and this is just speculation, they told the government about doing lockdowns, etc., and the government said these things are not possible, and so SAGE said, okay, look, these are the things that you need to do that are possible according to you guys. That's what I think happened, but that is speculation, and until a public inquiry and everything is made public happens, we won't know for certain. He told ITV's ITV's political editor and the Conservative Party's joint spokesperson, Robert Peston, that's a joke, by the way, in case anyone didn't get that. Robert Peston, that the government was warned about care homes being particularly high risk as early as February, and ministers were told they should stop infections getting into care homes. So they were told before most of the the really important stuff came out that care homes were a risk and to protect them. Despite this, until April 15th, the government's advice to hospitals was negative tests were not required prior to admissions into care homes. And we also know that councils were threatening care homes that if they didn't take these people back in, they would have their funding cut. So essentially, this is the government, an attack on old people led by the government and councils. The advice resulted in over a month passing in which thousands of hospital patients were discharged into care homes with coronavirus symptoms. Over 20,000 care home residents have died from coronavirus-related illness since COVID-19 hit the UK. Obviously, that number is accurate of when this article was written, which is September of last year, that number's going to be far higher now. Mr. Edmonds said the advice to hospitals prior to April 15th made no sense at all. So if he's saying it made no sense, and Sage are saying that they advised the government to protect care homes, and the government didn't, who were the government listening to? That's the question. Who were the government listening to? Because all this talk about we are following the science is simply untrue. That's been debunked by multiple different people right now. So the government admitting to mistakes is a good thing, but how much have they actually learned from this, and what are they going to do in the future? What are they going to do this year when people are talking about potentially another wave of COVID when restrictions end, because the vaccine, depending on how well the vaccination program goes and how successful the vaccine actually is to reduce the spread and to reduce hospitalization. Some of these things are relatively unknown. Obviously, studies show that the vaccine is doing well, and in limited numbers it shows the vaccine is doing well, but we don't know the full picture just yet. And so what we can gather from this is the government, yes, have admitted to making mistakes, but will there actually be punishments for this? Will people actually be held to account for the mistakes that they have made and the decisions they made that were wrong and were told they were wrong at the time? These are the things that are important now. It's all well and good saying, oh, we done goofed and the science was wrong and the civil servants were overconfident, etc. But at the end of the day, you were elected to lead. The buck stops with the government. The buck stops with ministers. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens from here. I wouldn't hold my breath on any consequences happening. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there. This video's dragged on a lot. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.